am Judith Panera. I'm the Executive Director for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Our offices are in New York, and today I am speaking to you from Brooklyn, New York City. As such, I would like to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and we pay respect to their communities, past and present. We would also like to acknowledge that we are each on Indigenous and Native lands and encourage everyone to connect with and research the tribal groups in their area. The systemic violence and racism at Black, Indigenous, and all people of color, including the murder of George Floyd, is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together. AAMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. And we call upon all our arts and cultural communities to take action to do better. I am humbled and grateful for our speakers and our audience and their generosity and commitment to today's webinar. We gave deep thought to proceeding with our program, and in deciding to move forward, we wanted to acknowledge the importance of gathering community and value in being responsive. 2, we wanted to recognize and honor the time and dedication of our audience and speakers made in creating space for this webinar. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Thank you. And Cecile, go ahead.
Thank you, Judith. It's my pleasure to be here today. We are at a moment, at a juncture, where should be more than just a moment, and it's not just a movement, but we need to understand that we have a mission and a commitment to anti-oppression, and we can do that through our organization and in our very lives, in our own daily lives. I want to say that this program today, Inclusivity in Isolation, is a program that we have been working on for a long time, and I'm pleased to introduce Myrtis Bedolla, the founding director of Galerie Myrtis, and a former board member of the Association of African American Museums, and Dr. Tuliza Fleming, Interim Chief Curator of Visual Arts at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian Institution. I'm very pleased and honored to have them on our virtual dais today as we spend 75 minutes together. This will be a conversation. We will talk about learnings from being sheltered in place from the coronavirus. And I also want to explain that we can learn so much from being in isolation. At this time in the last couple of weeks, we are seeing how much being together and working together means as individuals, as humans, as practitioners. And so I want to just ask, I want to start this conversation by asking our 2 panelists just to check in. And I want to ask all of you who are listening, all of you who are on Facebook, do a check-in too, an internal check-in and a silent check-in with us as we just share some thoughts and some reflections. Myrtis?
Thank you, Cecile. I'm honored to be here with you today and with Tuliza, who I highly respect. And I wish to also thank AAMC and AAAM for this collaboration and allowing us to address this very serious issue of isolation. And the opposite side of that is inclusion, and to be inclusive in our approach. I am feeling a bit somber today, to be honest with you, as someone who vows to operate and navigate this world from a position of high moral compass. and then to look at the actions of those who have chosen not to, who have preyed upon the weak, who use what they perceive as a position of superiority and power to demean others who are not like them, causes me great concern. So I hope that the outcome of this conversation to those who are listening is to value those that you consider as other, to break down the barriers of racism and discrimination in whatever position that you're able, and to be open and receptive to difference.
Thank you. Dr. Fleming, Tuliza.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you. I want to thank Judith, AAMC, AAAM for inviting me. I want to underscore the really beautiful and thoughtful statements that Myrtis just made. In terms of checking in, this has been a very difficult time. In terms of the concept of isolation, I know that for many, particularly people who live alone, or people who are away from their family, or people who have deaths in the family, or friends that they can't commiserate and really connect with people in times of need. I know that's very difficult. I've experienced that myself. I'm going in 7 months of isolation because I had foot surgery and I couldn't leave the house for 3 months. So this has been hard. The recent events have been very difficult and bring up some very painful memories of being stopped by police with my boyfriend as a young person on a regular basis for no reason whatsoever. So that's also a very complex notion that many African Americans across the country and within the field have experienced as well. So I think for myself and my colleagues and friends, this has been a really difficult time. And then watching our city, the nation's capital, the things that are going here as an American historian is deeply troubling and disappointing.
Thank you. Thank you both for being so open and candid. It's important to develop trust and develop pathways to listen to each other, because museums are truly about stories, and galleries, or artists tell stories, and together we can have a shared human experience as we connect with one another, and we develop ways to communicate that go beyond just paintings and sculptures and the art, because it's really about our humanity. And I want to talk about Myrtis Bedolla. Myrtis, in your gallery, you have actually pioneered a program that allows artists to check in and to express what they're feeling beyond, you know, the paper and canvas and paint and so forth. And I wonder if you can talk about that. We actually have some video that shares some messages from this program. So we will just go straight into the video, and Myrtis, after that, you'll contextualize it and then share some learnings from this program that allows people to connect even in isolation. Thank you.
Yes. So welcome to Tea with Myrtis, Artistically Speaking, which is a series of conversations with artists featured in the Women Heal Through Rite and Ritual exhibition. Today's guest is Tawny Chapman, a photographer who takes a multi-layered approach in producing work that investigates the politics of Blackness and the historical portrayal of the Black body. Welcome to Tea Time, Tawny.
Thank you.
It's so good to see you. So I begin each conversation by asking the artist how the coronavirus has impacted their artistic production, or if it has, how has the experience been for you?
It's so difficult to say because it has impacted and it has stopped me from doing things that I had scheduled, of course. The exhibitions have been pushed back or pushed online.
but as far as production, yes and no. It stopped some portrait sittings that I had scheduled in Maryland, and I'm stuck in Texas. So it stopped that, but it hasn't necessarily stopped me from being able to create. It's actually forced me to pick up where I left off on some other work that I put to the side and said I was going to come back to. So it allowed me to do that. But it is slowing me in the sense that I can't get things framed. Right now, my framer's shop is closed. He's in Maryland. A frame building company that I use, they were unable to ship me a frame that I had purchased. Another company that I started to use to build frames, they just messaged me and said they were shutting down their business after I think they said 40 years. It stopped me in little ways, but not completely.
So what she goes on to say, and the reason the question was posed is because I was reaching out to the artists that are in my current exhibition, which is Women Heal Through Rite and Ritual, which explores the African and Mexican diasporic traditions of healing and deities and protection and folk medicines. And because of the virus, we were not able to host the opening nor have our programming as planned. And so I began a series called, well, two actually, but the one that Tawny is being interviewed in is Tea with Myrtis, Artistically Speaking, which is an off-take of the Tea with Myrtis series that we host here in the gallery, in which arts professionals and artists sit around the table and we discuss why art is relevant. And so the question that was posed to Tawny, of course, was what impact the viruses had on her artistic production. And then she goes on to talk about why she creates her work and sort of these pivotal moments in her career that have shifted her artistic production. One was the death of her father, which forced her to look at and examine why she was even creating her work, because she began to chronicle his battle with prostate cancer. And then the other pivotal moment was the death of Trayvon Martin. And during that segment, she really begins to break down because she, as a mother of 3 children, is questioning why people would take joy in the murder of a child, an innocent child, and also why Black bodies are being seized upon, why they are not, Black children are not being valued. And that became the impetus for the work that we see now. And that is work that is speaks to the beauty of Black children. The imagery is such that it elevates the Black body. The experiences that she has had with her children walking through the museums where there was an absence of Black imagery really concerned her. So she was creating work in response to that, to offer her work as a counter narrative to the negative stereotyping and racist imagery that her children were being exposed to.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah, so one concept we want to get at too is just the connection, in isolation where we have not been able to be out amongst each other physically in many cases. Having that, that kind of meeting in public or meeting virtually. And you mentioned, sometimes having artists come to the studio, and to leave work at the studio door, just having those glimpses and those moments where you can connect, are equally as important. It's important to care about each other and to show that you care about not just how the work is made, and the philosophies behind the creation of the artwork, but also people as individuals. And I believe there was another brief clip that we were going to show, or did we take care of all of the clips from Tea with Myrtis? I apologize that I had some technical issues on my end, so I wasn't able to see the actual clips being shown. Okay, I think that we would also like to see that second video, if you would. So
Great.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and share that now.
Father
in museums, and you've talked.
I'm being ripped from the inside. Commercial jobs. I didn't know what I was gonna do, and I just started to create. I started to create because I started feeling like I'm in here. I'm like my world is being turned upside down. I'm feeling like I'm being ripped from the inside. Seeing all these things happening to us, happening to people that look like my son, my husband, my father, me. And I felt like there was more I could do than just complain. I mean, I was going to the marches, I was donating, but it felt like something more powerful that I could do. And so I just started creating. I just started creating stuff in response to what I was seeing, because if I would have let it, I feel like I could have become somebody I didn't want to become. A lot of anger and frustration and sadness was building up in me. Cardan had to tell me to just step away from it. But I was in such shock and disbelief that this was the world that my kids live in, that we have to walk around in, and this is happening to people like us every time I turn around. And so that's, it was no decision, that like, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, kind of all happened. And that's how I just started really switching what I wanted to focus on.
Hi, my name is Shaniqua Gay. I'm a multimedia artist living and working in Atlanta, Georgia. I am so proud to be featured in the exhibition Women Heal Through Rite and Ritual at Galerie Myrtis. I wanted to share a little bit about my work, and most specifically speaking to this piece, Summoning, which is featured in the exhibition. So when you think about the term, when you think about the word summoning, it means to call authoritatively. It's a call to action. It's a call for a meeting. It's an agenda. And I can think of no more powerful agenda than one of prayer. And so these women sit, kneeled together in prayer. I've created a series of chimera mythical figures from my imagination called the Devouts. And they're really characteristics of the women in my family who I felt like were the most devout women in the world. These church-going Southern Black women with thick bodices and beautiful features and figures. And I wanted to pull from the rituals of our past, from our ancestors, and also to speak to issues that we deal with today, this kind of hybrid experience of being African American, to be African in body and to be American in mind. And then to also speak to masking, this kind of antiquated old world way of summoning a spirit unto you. And with this image, these women sit between the material and spiritual world. For me, the spiritual world represents the galaxies, the cosmos, and the material world is represented in the earthly realm. And I want to be able to empower these figures, these women, to be able to summon, to be able to intercede on behalf of those who have no voice. And so within this body of work, I am looking for ways to express a ritual, to express divinity, to express the empowerment of Black women.
Okay, thank you. I understand that we are having technical difficulties, but I hope that you were able to see some imagery and words of artists who were so moved by their own lived experiences, especially as regarding oppression, racism, and pain, and how they were able to transfer and translate that into their work. It's so important to develop these relationships with our artists and with folks who are committed to anti-racism in the field, whether it's through the art or through administration or in whatever position that someone may hold, because we are in this together. And I just want to make a comment, in as much as we have had some technical difficulties today, as we are working in isolation, we have all discovered that things can be a little messy, and they are not necessarily as, as ordered or as polished or as, quote unquote professional. That's also a word that's quite loaded, and we wonder, professional according to whom. But it really does take us back to what really matters and what's most important, right? It's people. We are people universally sharing experiences, and at this moment, experiences that we have never encountered before with such intensity. And COVID-19 and sheltering in place have taught us lessons that I think can be transferred as we continue our drive to be anti-racist. I want to now turn the time over to Dr. Fleming to say a few words, and also to thank Myrtis very much for sharing her practice. Dr. Fleming, I wonder if you could please opine a little bit about diversity and inclusion in a culturally specific organization. Sometimes we talk about DEAI, or diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, as a way to diversify our staff, or a way to bring in people from other races or ethnicities. But there's so much more to it than that. And there's more that we can think about, even if we're still sheltered in place or as we're preparing our reopening plans. What are some implications that thinking about inclusivity and isolation have for you at the Smithsonian, Tuliza?
Well, I would first say that it's interesting because one of the primary reasons, one of them, to get into the field was really to fight for diversity and inclusions in non-ethnic specific museums, although one could possibly say these traditional institutions can be rather ethnic specific as well. I think that working at the National Museum of African American Culture is a really unique experience. We are probably the most diverse museum in the world, I would imagine. I can't believe that it's not. And we have people from all backgrounds, all races, all economic backgrounds as well. People, even though there is a shared experience amongst the Black staff, I think one of the things that we really don't deal with as much as other museums is feeling of isolation in terms of the way you look. I mean, there are many people who look the way you look, and it's very affirmative. And I think that, there are lots of other problems, as there are in any other institution, but being African American is not amongst them. So most people don't walk in, I imagine, feeling that, heavy burden on their heart. And it's a very, and the staff is very affirming. So when you walk in the door as a Black woman, there are all sorts of Black women. Oh, I love your hair. I love your outfit. I mean, just the physical adornment and diversity of that is really quite lovely. And it's all accepted. You know, that personal style, that personal way of approach is very freeing. I think that since we last spoke about this conference, this idea of what happened with George Floyd and the protest also underscores a shared experience there, because there's so many people in that institution that understand the gut punch that this has had and the protest and the history of protest. So I think that's also a unique experience. I think the isolation in the sense at this museum was, for me, really brought out by that COVID experience. The idea of not being able to see your colleagues, working at home. I can't tell you how much I miss my colleagues. And I think that also this idea of coming back, as we all know, African Americans are more at risk. And so I wonder what that means when we have to return to work and how that's navigated, even more so than I would think the general population. I'm technically high risk. And so how do I think about that? I imagine I'm not the only one who's thinking about this idea of working at home and what that means in isolation and also being a high risk population. So I think there's some very unique things that happen at our museum in terms of this idea of diversity, but there are other very shared experiences that I think that the rest of the world is also experiencing as well. And I don't know if I answered your question or you have a follow-up to that.
I will follow up, but thank you. Yes, I mean, that opens a window into a world that very few museum practitioners are able to see. It's very rare, you know, again, that there's such a diverse, as you say, yours is the most arguably, well, unarguably, the most diverse museum in the United States. And then speaking to a specific experience, a specific history, a shared struggle, there's a lot of solidarity there. And I think, you know, not being able to see your colleagues, not being able to work on these projects that talk about these struggles has been isolating emotionally as well as just physically. I think that's what I want to start talking about too as well. Sometimes we consider technology to be the end all and be all and the equalizer. And so I think being sheltered in place, you know, as beautiful and as wonderful it is to have technology as a way to forward conversations, just as we saw with the Galerie Myrtis. Sometimes if we let technology be a way of, you know, holding meetings and just solving all of the other kinds of work issues and scenarios and problems, we forget that there are people who maybe don't have access to the internet or not access that is well suited to a day's work. There are people who are undergoing trauma and people who are, as we've both talked about, you know, immunocompromised or otherwise unable to leave their home and to experience nature. You know, there are people who already have had some of the restrictions lifted, but at the same time, there are people perhaps with disabilities, people with hidden disabilities or temporary disabilities who are unable to fully participate in the ways that that we may not even think about or may not imagine. So would you want to talk about perhaps, you know, some of those lessons that you're learning about being in isolation physically and understanding that it's important to connect with the larger museum world, knowing that it's not accessible to everyone? How has that built maybe empathy and compassion? Well, and either of you can answer.
It is, you know, I think I see your cat here saying
And
hello.
yes, I'm very sorry about my cat.
So I think that if people weren't empathetic in terms of people with pre-existing conditions, people who struggle every day, as what you said, maybe getting to work or maybe having to work from home, I hope that this experience will bring a broader appreciation for being around one another, a broader appreciation for the difficulties that people face that you might not have thought about in the past, even the idea of getting to work or who goes to work, who has a choice, who doesn't have a choice. I think these are issues that perhaps all of us are thinking more deeply about, having more empathy. I hope that things will, you know, we are, as a museum, I think that museums were really just recently in the past decades really grappling with this idea of accessibility in a much broader sense. The idea of being sight impaired, hearing impaired, things of that nature. Were I saw really being addressed recently in very serious and meaningful ways. I think that's only going to increase over time, and really understanding all of the barriers. What does it mean to be elderly and going to a museum at this time? What does it mean to go to a museum and having to go back to a family member who may not be able to come? How do you, now that people aren't coming, how do you give really meaningful experiences to people who only have internet access when our whole field is about the object and seeing that object in person? How do you make that meaningful? And how do you have those discussions? I think that, you know, our museum recently put out a wonderful program talking about race. And I would encourage everyone to look at that on our website. And I'm really proud of all of the people who made that happen, because it's a really unique experience for people to go to a museum and really have meaningful, open, intellectual, informative information that you can use in terms of thinking about your own self and how you look at yourself in relation to others, how you talk to your children about race, which people don't normally want to do, how to really talk with school children, talk with your parents. These are things that we don't have access to. So we talk a lot about race, and we talk a lot about discrimination, and we talk a lot about making a difference, but most people don't know how. They don't have the tools. And I was looking at that site, and it's such a monumental event for a museum to really be able to do it. And other people in the museums will also be able to access that. So I think that, you know, these are things that we can do. Unfortunately, there are a lot of limitations when you can't go to a physical space and people may not have access to computers and internet. And COVID complicating that, because normally you would go out into the community. And these are things that are very difficult to do. So I imagine many museums are grappling with that. I don't exactly know the answer to those questions.
Yes. Thank you. And again, with this COVID-informed world, you know, we're not going to know all the answers. And I think, again, you know, we're so used to having and quickly finding answers. And we're now having to find creative solutions, being a lot more patient with each other. That's one lesson that I'm sure we have all learned from this shelter in place world, this COVID-informed world. Myrtis, did you have, and thank you so much, Tuliza. Myrtis, did you have anything to say about this particular question?
Oh, yes. I mean, in many ways, my gallery operates as a museum in that we provide programming. We really seek to engage the community in all that we do here, and everyone is welcome. So while we specialize in African American art, our roster of artists is very diverse, and our programming is diverse as well. So we are able to cast a wide net in terms of who comes physically visits the gallery space, and then our audience that supports us online as well. So the closure really forced us to reevaluate the ways in which we were reaching individuals, because we could not allow anyone to come into our space. And at a time where an exhibition is about healing, it's really unfortunate that we have not been able to allow people to engage with the incredible work, the thought-provoking work that we have here. So we began to reassess what a virtual, or assess what a virtual exhibition would be. When, things started closing down, businesses started closing down, my email was inundated with emails, messages from galleries who were doing a quote virtual exhibition. And I began to make an assessment of what that was and what that then should be for us. And what I didn't want it to be was just an image of an artwork with a description and price. That to me was not the type of experience that I wanted our supporters, patrons, to have, not from us. And so I began to think about the importance of the artist's voice, the importance of the work that we have here, and how best that information could be communicated and conveyed. So out of that came the artist shorts, which is Shaniqua Gay's footage was an example of, in which is solely the artist's narrative, speaking about a particular work that's featured in the exhibition, and unpacking that work, talking about its importance, its significance, and what it means to that particular artist. And then the other effort that came out of the closure was the Tea with Myrtis, artistically speaking, in which I'm in conversation with the artist. And as you saw with Tawny, her very emotional response to what is happening in our society. And that may not have ever been revealed through just sending out a statement or sending out an image of her work without having that backstory behind it, understanding the importance of why she created it. So we have relied more heavily on technology, but have tried to put out content that is very rich and thoughtful in our approach.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And I can imagine that you will continue. This is just one way of reaching audiences, but knowing how much it has helped in, humanizing the artists again. I like what you said about not just an image, a thumbnail, and a sticker price, but really telling those stories and allowing people to look into the lives of the artists and understand their struggles and issues and daily lives. That absolutely helps in understanding and basking in our shared humanity and understanding what it means to be Black and to be human. So at this time, I'm hoping that we can get some questions from our audience. I am looking in our chat window and expecting and hoping that we can have some questions. But until that happens, I want to just talk about other institutions that are potentially doing even work that goes beyond normal programming for a museum in terms of exhibitions and arts education. I'm familiar with organizations. I'll give a shout out to a couple of them, perhaps Pioneer Works in Red Hook in Brooklyn, New York, that they're addressing food scarcity. That was something that immediately with the COVID situation in New York, that was a deep and intense problem, situation, a challenge that needed some support. And so even though this institution is really about art, about visual and performing arts, it banded together, even though all of the staff were at home, and they created pathways by which food could be sourced and delivered, and accessible physically to anyone who needed and wanted it. There are also other programs that they're starting to consider in terms of mental and emotional health and safety, sewing masks, long before any of that was happening several weeks ago. So there are other ways that you can think of perhaps addressing needs, and that can go beyond this COVID informed time. That can go all the way into the future of your organizational planning. I see here there's a question or a suggestion, insight on how cultural institutions can reach those without virtual access. Would either of you like to address that?
I would like to address it. As of this week, my gallery and others in Baltimore, along with several artists, have been invited to be a part of the Baltimore Museums of Art, Baltimore Museum of Art's Salon. It's a new initiative that is doing many wonderful things to help with Baltimore's art ecology. As a gallerist, they're also supporting nonprofit organizations, arts organizations as well. So part of the initiative is one, financial relief. So for my gallery, others, and the nonprofit organizations, the BMA has given us and will be giving us $2,500. That, however, is based on our providing them with a list of requirements, and part of that is that, for example, I had to send them information about my gallery, the artist, so on and so forth. And they're also providing monies for local artists. So, what has also been critical is for businesses and artists to sustain themselves. And with this, the monies granted from the BMA, that is certainly very welcome and helpful to us. And what we will be able to take advantage of is the BMA's reach in terms of promoting the gallery, promoting the artists. They are not looking to receive any money from us in terms of sales, but so it's really quite wonderful what they're doing, the reach that they're having as cultural ambassadors, and part of their civic duty is the way in which this is being approached. One of the programs that the BMA has embarked on is because they are closed, they're creating art kits and having them distributed in like the Greenmount community in Baltimore. So that's a way in which, beyond technology, this institution is reaching the community. And then a second initiative, which I've been able to benefit from, is the United Talent Agency, UTA Art Space. I've been asked to curate an exhibition there, and it was going to be physically in the space, but because of the virus, it has shifted to a virtual experience. I think we will be the first for them because we were next in line to have a show, and that will launch on June 5th. So, there are ways in which, and I mentioned the BMA because it's a collaboration. Both of these are collaborative efforts. And I think, those collaborations, now we have to take a more creative and far-reaching approach to forming relationships in ways that perhaps were not thought of before, because our new normal dictates that we have to think outside of the box and beyond it so that we can sustain the artist who all institutions rely on in the art realm, of course. I know I do, and I'm sure that most museums do, because it's the artisans who have either created the items or the artwork that lies on the walls. So I hope that, the BMA's model will be looked at very carefully and studied, and in some ways can be replicated by other institutions as well.
Thank you for that, Myrtis. The questions are now coming hard and fast. Thank you to everyone who is putting those questions forward. But before I do that, Tuliza, did you have anything to answer about programming?
Well, one of the interesting things when I was speaking with Myrtis and also listening to you and talking about that food distribution program, I know in speaking with my colleagues that many museums are really having to concentrate on how to reopen and how to navigate that. There was a very heavy reliance on an online presence in the past. Also, there were several programs that many museums around the country were instituting in terms of actually going out into the community and working with, well, for us, local institutions and organizations to our community curation program, or we were gathering stories, people's personal stories about living in the era of COVID-19. But I think that when you brought up those particular museums were doing really interesting and innovative things, that I think that hopefully when all of this dies down and people can go back out, you'll have a really, really strong connection that was forged in very non-traditional ways. And I'm wondering if there's any way that I think all of us in the audience, all of us, who are thinking about these things, that museums could talk about what they're doing on a forum, and that other museums could access that and even sort of implement it, if possible, in their own locality. So I really think it's an interesting idea.
It's an excellent idea and one we should pursue. I would say that we should start. I think that we've been sometimes afraid to share our resources, as curators, private people, and we're protecting our research and our work. But in this matter, I think it's important to share our resources collaboratively. Let me get to some of these questions, which are really insightful and thoughtful. One of the questions is, what are some ways you would suggest that museum curators, especially those who are white and or who work at non-culturally specific institutions, can actually move the needle forward, not only during this time of isolation, but ultimately, perhaps even more importantly, for the long-term future? That's a really important question.
Can you repeat the last part of that question, please?
Yes. So the question again is, how can mostly white museum curators, or especially white museum curators, move the needle forward, not only during the time of isolation, but for the long-term future?
I would suggest a couple of things. First of all, really understand that you're culturally specific too, and that you have a culture and there is a race and whiteness does matter in this country. And so really to embrace and think about who you are and what that means to navigate this society, and to understand that you have a culture and you have a history that affects and intersects other people. I was reading an article the other day that talked about how other ethnicities really need to understand white culture to navigate through their entire lives. But people who are white often don't need to at all. And I think that if you want to move forward, you really have to read some books. There are excellent books that talk about this. I have a book, I think White Fragility is often recommended for people who are interested in learning and becoming more insightful. Check in on your colleagues, really, and ask them how they're doing. I think that when we talk about checking in on each other, sometimes it's best to listen because people are going through a lot of pain. I don't think people always understand why, as a person who might be, upper middle class, have a higher degree, live a very sort of middle class, sheltered lifestyle as an African American or a Native American or something like that, still are extremely, extremely affected by these issues, and understand that they may not be able to work as effectively during this time. There may be issues of depression, but I think one of the ways to move the needle forward is to be curious and to be empathetic, to listen, to go out when we can into the community and really listen to them, and maybe not necessarily react. I'm talking to my colleagues, and maybe not every museum needs to make a statement. Maybe you need to think about how you walk in solidarity without necessarily doing something that's ephemeral. So if you realize that there are people in your museum who are feeling isolated, what can you do as an institution, even if it's just internally, to make that long-term impact? Is it really to do diversity training and make everyone in the museum attend and have that to be an ongoing program, not one shot, we know about what bias is, and then we go back to work? How do you take this moment to really change how you see yourselves and your relationship to your colleagues and your relationship to the community? And it doesn't always have to be the same for every institution, right? And I think that's up to the locality, the mission, the community that you're in, to really sort of think through those things and ask for advice. There's a lot of literature out there, and you have to take the time. But if you don't, it will be very rewarding.
It can be, and the resources that your institution has just put out, those are a good start. But again, there are other books, you mentioned White Fragility. There are many other resources that we can guide you to, or AAMC can guide you to. You can look at these on your own. You can talk to colleagues, but we need action. So in terms of moving the needle, commitment to action and working towards it, that's key.
And also,
Myrtis?
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
You can actually have biases and do things that may be considered offensive to others and still be a good person. It is not an either or situation. Everybody has biases, and even studies have shown that because when we grow up in this culture, you can't avoid it. And studies have shown that even African Americans may have biases to other African Americans because we live in this culture and we live in this media. It can't be helped. And so it's difficult to look at that, but it doesn't make you a bad person. And if you look at it, you can make the changes necessary. But I think sometimes people are afraid to look at it because you realize that you may not always be who you thought you were, but that's okay. That's part of the journey.
That's wonderful, Tuliza. Thank you. So important to remember that we all harbor biases, but the key is to work towards eliminating them. There's a question for Myrtis now, and the question is, you talked a lot about really featuring the artist and telling their stories. Have you ever encountered a moment where an artist was adamant about separating their identity and the idea of the artist from the art itself? If so, how did you approach this?
Yes, I have. There are some artists who do not want to be defined by their race, and I am very respectful of that. I serve as a catalyst, a conduit through which the art is shown and featured. I let and allow the artist to dictate how he or she wishes to be represented. So it's a very easy path for me. I don't come before the artist comes first. I am in a role in which I serve their needs as the gallerist. So it's never any tension there because I am certain about why I exist, what I'm here to do for them. And I'd just like to address Tuliza, respond to the question that Tuliza responded to, and just applaud her for such an excellent response. I have served as a curator in several museums as well as an independent curator, and have, of course, not of course, but I've curated exhibitions with African American artists, and for the most part because the curators on staff were not comfortable in doing so. And so some of the artists expressed to me the concern that the staff in those institutions were always so aloof and not reachable and not amenable to being open and receptive to their narrative, to what it is they wanted to say. And so for curators who are not African American, part of what I would suggest is find a way to, one, integrate yourself into the communities in which you serve. What does your constituency look like? And if it's well represented in your institution, then seek the constituency that isn't, and form relationships with them and understand their plight, their needs, what it is that they want, and what and how in which they wish to be represented within the institution, on the walls, in the cases, in whatever way, you know, that museum operates. Because if you just look at the mission of the organization and then broaden that mission to be inclusive, because that's really what we're talking about here, and it may need to be redefined as we operate in isolation, but make sure certain that as you tick off those boxes of, okay, we've served this group and that group, that everyone has been well represented in your efforts.
You know, I agree with that, Myrtis, so much. And I think one of the reasons when you talk about curators not feeling comfortable, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to sit in discomfort. And really, yes, the empathy about it is, you know, many of your colleagues sit in discomfort every day. Every day, when people walk out of the house, there is a discomfort. And there is a wondering if this is connected to race or gender or whatever, and it goes throughout your life. And I think that when I talk to my colleagues, there is a real hope that people will step out of this comfort zone, go into an all African American or all Latino community and be the only white person in that room and be okay with that, because that gives you insight of what it means to be the only minority in the room every single day. You know, look at your colleagues, look at your security. Don't see them as invisible. These are not invisible people. They see you. You should see them. So I think that the discomfort and just being okay with that is important to move forward.
Wonderful. Those are, we still do have time for one or two more questions. Thank you for your answers. We have a lot of questions coming in. Some of the questions have to do with welcoming visitors back into spaces, knowing that organizations that previously had challenges with inclusion will now need to make extra efforts to strive for healthy environments, even with physical distancing imposed. There are questions about access being an obstacle for African Americans, such as unpaid internships, and perhaps having a more robust virtual life during the shelter at home phase may offer some new avenues for participation. Another interesting question is about community outreach and the stories that we are collecting and how we can share those in new ways. There's so many ideas and questions. I think we will be able to answer some of them in writing, but I'll just throw this out there as a conversation piece for maybe 5 or 7 more minutes, in terms of anything that kind of grabbed you as I was reading off those topics quickly, and if either of you would like to respond.
Well, just quickly, for reopening, we are now grappling with that idea and what that will mean. So the approach at this point, at least, will be that we will require that individuals wear masks, and we will keep the group small. We will no longer have food at our receptions. I'm trying to come up with some concept for a goodie bag or a Myrtis swag bag as a way of showing our appreciation for people who do come in. So that's where we are now. I am committed to having the current exhibition up until we are able to reopen it and share it in whatever way that we're able.
Thank you.
You know, it's interesting when you, the question about the paid versus unpaid internships, that is always a major issue in museums. I think that for many museums who have to contemplate or have had to furlough people, and even some have to consider selling objects to keep afloat. I don't know what the answer is when it comes to having the money to continue internships, unless you get an external grant or you have a really wonderful donor. But I would also like people to even consider not just minority groups, but when you're talking about the importance of paid internships, there are people who from socially disadvantaged backgrounds who are white, who also need to have access to museums to bring a different voice. I did have a colleague who did feel isolated because he came from Appalachia, a white man from Appalachia, and felt a little very different from his colleagues because he didn't have those chances. So yes, I would not have been able to intern without paid internships myself. So it's a wonderful thing. But there are other diversity issues, inclusion issues, I think that are also important in terms of things like social, economic, and disability, and things of that nature that we don't always think about when it's time to bring young people into the museum. So just food for thought, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do offer a paid internship, and hoping to, this will be my first. I have had unpaid internships in the past, but I now have established a paid internship. So I'm actually looking for candidates right now.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's so important in building the field, you know, and establishing pathways to move forward and to ensure that Black and Brown people can have rightful places within the museum. And speaking of race, one of the questions has to do with whether or not either of you has had to self-censor and not be able to talk about issues around race in your various places of employment. And of course, for Tuliza, it's a little different. But for the benefit of the field, how would you, navigate that if you feel that you have to censor yourself in talking about race and racism?
Well, for me personally, I have not had to censor myself. And in some circles, I guess I have a reputation of being someone who maybe they wish I had. But my mission in the gallery is to allow for artists to freely speak. And many of our exhibitions address cultural, social, and political concerns. So this space, the gallery space, is one that truly supports creatives and freedom of expression. So I operate with the freedom in knowing that I will speak my mind and support those who wish to as well.
Thank you.
I actually worked in a wide variety of museums and galleries, majority white, majority Black, very large museums, very small museums. I was raised by an activist, so I have, and my personality does not lend itself to self-censorship. I have talked to many people who do feel the need to do that. And there's a real need because I've been called on the carpet about it many times throughout my lifetime, in terms of things that I say, advocating for diversity in collections, being called names behind my back, which I found out later, or people thinking I shouldn't, it's not my place, interestingly enough, to bring up these issues. A lot of people are afraid to be labeled that angry Black woman. So there are those choices that you make, and everybody makes those choices. I often talk about where I am now. I can say things and do say things as an advocate that I'm sure if I was at another museum and somebody wrote to the director, I mean, I'd be in their office. But I talk to our deputy director all the time about this, and this idea that if somebody were to say, you know, she's speaking up about race in a very blunt and frank manner, they would say, good job. And it's important that people have the freedom to do so. People don't feel free to do so. And a lot of times your institution doesn't even know that these are problems because people are afraid to say that. And I think the other important thing is for people who aren't minorities to speak up, because that's another big problem, being the one minority in the room. Someone says something everybody knows is really off color and no one speaks up. Or, you know, the person does speak up and you leave the room and all of your white colleagues are like, I'm glad you said that. I was thinking the same thing, you know, but you can speak up so that the person doesn't always have to make that decision sitting around the conference table. Do I say something or don't I, in fear of retribution?
Thank you. That's so important. And as Jude mentioned earlier with the statement from AAMC Foundation, it's not enough to be passively non-racist. You have to be actively anti-racist. And that goes for all of us. And there's a lovely question that came about in terms of how white practitioners, how white employees in cultural institutions can best support Black colleagues who may be feeling especially isolated and traumatized at this moment. And I appreciate that question. This person was mentioned that they were afraid of perhaps saying or doing the wrong thing, but can either of you speak to what you would want to hear best?
Well, I think that the best way, in my view, is to just be empathetic and to listen. I don't possess a white skin, and so I can't speak from a white experience, but I can speak from the Black experience. And I've been called a nigger more times than I can remember. And I don't say N-word. This is where we talk about self-censoring, because no racist has ever said, hey, N-word. They've outright called me a nigger. And so, you know, it just, if you really are concerned about your Black colleagues, then just be present for them in the way that is best. And the best way to know that is simply to ask. And I'm sure if whatever way in which you can be helpful to them, which may not be the fact that they may not want to talk about it. They may not be comfortable having a conversation with a white person or anyone. You know, sometimes we internalize a lot and really don't want to be in dialogue, even with another a Black person. So I think just knowing that you're present for that individual, and then ask how best they would like for you to be present for them.
I think that's a really good point. Listening is so important. The one thing you don't want to do if somebody confides in you about, I think this statement really offended me, is to say, oh, no, don't diminish it. Don't have to explain it away. Listen to that person, believe them. Okay, because as you were saying, Myrtis, you live all of your life and you do know when something is happening, even though it's a microaggression. I think that a lot of times people don't want to confide, because once you do, then you have to defend how you feel, and how you feel is being diminished because that person has never had that experience. Absolutely. It's like being stopped by the police. People think, well, if you just do what you're supposed to do and follow a new flight, everything will be okay, because you can't imagine as a white woman that the police driving and being stopped and being nervous and not knowing what's going to happen, and not knowing that even if you do the right things, something bad may happen, as we see. And it's very difficult to understand these situations if you've never had to deal with that in your life, and to really sort of understand that is really important. And the other thing is trust. So if you want to have a rapport and be able to talk to someone. That trust has to be built often before the event.
Mm.
You know, have dinner with someone, invite them to your house, have conversations intermittently, at your job. But don't expect, as Myrtis says, that somebody is going to confide some of these really gut feelings to you if they don't have a previous relationship. And then the only time they're interested in how you're feeling is when there are protests all over the country.
Yeah. Very true. And we have to practice these conversations. And I love that you said, it's important not to just have these, check-ins when something disastrous is happening to and about us, right? But to develop those relationships. So we have just a couple of minutes to wrap up. I want to say that this has been a very lively, albeit solemn, it's been an interesting conversation, just because of the moment in which we're in. And I want to thank and say how much I appreciate all of you for, giving this hour of your attention and for engaging in these insightful questions and thoughtful remarks about inclusivity and isolation, but also about this current moment and all we are learning and doing all we're learning and doing in order to be inclusive. So I want to just draw your attention to the fact that this webinar is being recorded and will be in the archive. Really appreciative again of our guests and all of you for being here. And with that, I want to say, not only is it in the archive for you to view, but we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Go to the artcurators.org website, both for this recording and for information about our panelists and for future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.